the Deschutes Railroad War, as it's generally called, it refers to the Deschutes River in Central Oregon. And the development of a rail system into Central Oregon didn't take place in a serious fashion until approximately 1908, when the two major competing railroads in the Northwest, the Great Northern run by Jim Hill and then the Union Pacific by Mr. Herriman, both decided that they wanted to tap the vast timber wealth that was in Central Oregon. And to do that, they needed a rail system. When I talk about Jim Hill and Mr. Herriman, E.H. Herriman of the Union Pacific, what we're talking about are two of the most famous railroad builders in the United States of all time. They were part of that small cadre of very determined, very powerful, sometimes ruthless businessmen that would take on great risk. They would bring together supporters of money, but they would run the show. Government regulation was either minimal or was somewhat ignored by these gentlemen. They often were called rail barons, and they would certainly love to fix prices and do things that the government has since tried to thwart through antitrust, etc. But these gentlemen, Hill and Herriman, were two competitors. They both had rail systems that came from the east and were going to the west. The two railroads were interested in the same area at the same time, and the only logical, feasible means to get into this area was down what's called the Deschutes River Canyon. And so, ironically, the two companies began surveying and construction of their two rail systems almost at the same time on opposite sides of this same river. And the goal was to reach the heart of Central Oregon, which was Bend, and to tap into that timber wealth. And so the logic of the time was the first railroad to successfully complete the line into Bend would be able to tie up most of the shipping traffic and be the successful operator of the railroad. So the two companies, by timing, ended up building side by side down the same river canyon at the same time. And that started a race to Bend. And during that time period, the crews were given incentives to build as fast as they could, get ahead of the other railroad, and some of the crews took that to heart. And what they would do is they figured, okay, we can only build so fast during the daytime, but maybe we can slow up the other railroad if at night we cross the river and then do something to sabotage or slow down their operation, blowing up track, bridges, whatever was being built by the competitor. And that was where the Deschutes Railroad War name came from. Actually, nobody was injured. There weren't shots fired like some people think, but there was some mischief done between the two companies. This culminated at one point in time that Herriman had let an easement lapse along his right-of-way where he needed to get his shipments in. Hill discovered that. Hill went and acquired that easement and then blocked Herriman from any further progress down the canyon. Herriman took Hill to court. They had a court hearing. A judge decided that Hill was just trying to block the traffic, told the gentleman to try to calm this whole thing down. You need to find a way to work it out. Let Herriman back onto his property, and construction resumed. Within a few months, Herriman himself fell ill and passed away. And even though his company continued to maneuver down the railroad right-of-way and building as quick as possible, Herriman himself was gone. Sometime after that death, Hill's forces and Herriman's forces decided this is getting crazy, because when we get down to the Madras area, which is north of Bend here, we're not going to have room for two railroads anymore. The Crooked River Gorge is one of the impediments that the railroad realized they were going to have to encounter and cross in order to get to Bend. And that was one of the obstacles. They said it makes absolutely no sense on this huge chasm of a gorge to build two railroad tracks parallel. So that was one of the reasons that the railroads decided, okay, let's figure out who's going to own this, who can operate on it, we'll build one track. That bridge was the very first crossing of the Crooked River Gorge. There was no highway crossing, there was no road crossing. It was a straight vertical chasm of about 900 feet straight down on both sides, rock walls vertical, and absolutely no slope to it at all. And so if you wanted to cross, you wanted to cross at the closest point, but it's still hundreds of yards wide and enormously steep down to the bottom. So how did they build it? Well, Ralph Majeski developed a bridge building system, and it was an arch structure to give it great support. And what he did was he had one crew working from the north end And then all of the supplies to build the south end of the bridge at the same time had to be lowered down one side, cross the river, the Crooked River at the bottom, and then raised up on the other side. And the bridge was actually constructed simultaneously from both sides, even though one was accessible to the rail system that had come down that far, but there was no rail system to bring supplies in from the south side. Finally, as the two spans became close enough, they actually found a nice long wooden plank that they could drop across and lay it across the two spans. And so now the workers, there's famous pictures of them, would just walk across this wooden plank that was only about 1.5 feet wide, no railing, it wasn't attached to anything, and you see these men walking across this in middle of the air plank because it was easier than going down the rope ladders and up the rope ladders until they finally joined it. But the bridge took, from beginning to end, the construction was less than 3 months. And that bridge has never been altered, never had to been rebuilt or changed, and it's still in service today, and it was one of the famous parts of the puzzle of what the Oregon Trunk rail system was all about. So it ended up that Hill actually won the war, he got to Bend, and he drove the Golden Spike here in October 1911 because he was the successful operator. And within a space of just a year and a half, 2 years, Bend's population went to 8,000 people because it was brought in by the railroad. The mills got started. 2 huge mills, which became the largest pine producing mills in the West, were built here, and they were hauling out huge quantities. And of course then housing developed and all the infrastructure of a town, and Bend grew and blossomed and exploded in size, all because of the railroad. Over the years after that, it made no sense in the north part of the canyon to have 2 different railroads operating in the same area. So over the years, the best of the right-of-ways was preserved and the other right-of-ways abandoned. So today we have one track called the Oregon Trunk, all the way from the Columbia Gorge down to Bend. The railroad now is a major route for freight traffic north and south to allow that traffic to traverse up and down the Pacific coast basically, but inland from the mountain range to allow it to go to Canada, south to California, east to Texas, east to Chicago, and it's a major freight system. This was both of those gentlemen's last great rail expansion during their lifetime. And it did pit these 2 gentlemen head to head, going down the same canyon on opposite sides in a race, and it was something that, they are famous for. But it was a classic example of American entrepreneurism in the early stages.